I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is my wrap-up for mid-October through mid-November. I started the middle of October by reading Strides by Benjamin Cheever. I hold up the cover like this because I have since lent this book to my mother-in-law, but it does have a great cover. Subtitle being Running Through History with an Unlikely Athlete. So this book looks at both Ben Cheever's personal history of running as a teenager and then as an adult. He's a running enthusiast. It also looks at the history of running as a sport, so it looks at the shorter distances that were in the ancient Olympics in Greece. It talks a little bit about the run from Marathon to Athens after the Battle of Marathon that started out the marathon distance. The author also goes and does a running tour in northern Kenya, so he gets to see where a lot of the elite runners train, and the tourists there get to go do a run with them. They all lose, but it's fun. And he looks at the way amateur running as a social sport, or not just as a social sport, but as a hobby, has taken off, and the way the science around running and whether running is healthy or not, and so on and so forth. I don't think there's a lot new there if you've read about the history of running, and if you've read anyone's sort of personal memoir of being a avid but non-professional distance runner. This is pretty standard stuff, but it was a fun read. I'm going to say Benjamin Cheever is John Cheever's son, and he talks about that, which I think some people would be irritated by, because I know that strikes some people as bragging. Personally, I always find it awkward when somebody has a very famous parent and they're telling something that is part memoir, as this is, and they never mention it. That drove me a little bit crazy in Emily Urquhart's Beyond the Pale, which is sitting on this shelf here, which is just out of vision. And she never mentions that she's Jane Urquhart's daughter, even though she's talking about her family. And that irritated me a little. Now, I know some people are the complete opposite, and they'd rather people not mention their famous family members, but I liked that he mentioned that. But I feel like I have to say that because I know some people really hate that. So that is in there. But it was a fun read. Not a great book, but a fun read. So after that, I had been planning to read Beverly Graves Meyer's Whispers of Vivaldi, because since I am in Toronto, I went and saw a couple of Baroque operas. The Canadian Opera Company was doing Handel's Ariodante, and Opera Atelier was doing Henry Purcell's Dido and Aeneas, and they were one day after each other that I went and saw those, and I thought, I'll read this on the subway down there. But this book didn't fit in my purse, so I'm going to read this some other time, and instead I had to read something that would be a little bit smaller and actually fit in my purse when I went down there. So I read Béla Zombory-Moldován's The Burning of the World, the subtitle is A Memoir of 1914, so as you can imagine, it's about the lead up to and then his experiences during the early part of the First World War. And it was translated by his grandson, which adds an interesting side to it. Even though I'm a pretty big First World War buff, I had actually never read anything by a Hungarian author about it, so this was interesting for me to read. The author was an artist, so he has very much that artist sensibility when he's describing his memories. He was injured fairly early in the war and was declared unfit for service at that time, so he didn't serve for a particularly long time. So this is all about a fairly short period of time, which was very interesting because you go very quickly from not quite enthusiasm, because he wasn't somebody who was particularly young. He was in his late 20s, so he didn't have that teenage enthusiasm that I think a lot of war memoirs have. But you get to the disillusionment very quickly, and it was an interesting read both because he was in combat for such a short period, but did end up ultimately shell-shocked, or with PTSD as we say now. That was approached somewhat differently than it is if you've read English memoirs or fictionalized accounts of that, or historical accounts of that. The angle of that was different in the Hungarian context, so just that in itself was interesting. Definitely worth reading. Glad I picked that one up. And I followed that up with another memoir, and this is Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel, which is sort of a reread. I read this about 20 years ago, but that was a different translation. This is a new translation that came out in 2003. I don't really remember it from having read it that other time, So I'm assuming that this is better, and because it's more memorable, but it's been a while, so who knows. This is sort of unique among First World War memoirs in that there isn't an extra angle behind it. You can read a lot of the earliest memoirs, the ones that were written early in the war, and some of them have have a bit of a nationalistic push behind them, and you read some of the later ones, and they tend to have more of a political angle, or there's tends to be sort of a bitterness to them, if not a sort of pacifist's angle. Like, I mean, Testament of Youth is a good example of that. Whereas this is just straightforward. He's telling you what happened, and he found it exciting. He got injured 14 times. He survived the war. Obviously, he survived to be 103. He lived a long time. He was, I think, 19 when the war started, but despite all his injuries, he lived a really long time. I think some people present this as being more nationalistic than I think it was, because he's so open about, and enthusiasm almost sounds wrong, because he wasn't, the angle isn't so much of being an enthusiastic killer as that he was very respectful of the process. Like when he comes across British and New Zealander and Indian and other French troops at various points, he's very respectful of them in almost a sportsmanship kind of way, which is a really different angle, because a lot of the tone could almost be a sports memoir, except it's actually about the First World War. So it's very unique in that the angle is so apolitical and so straightforward, and not in terms of the tone in that way, but also in terms of description, which are, again, evocative, but not in a poetic way, in a very literal way. So that's very unique among a lot of the memoirs that you read. Definitely a good one. I was on the fence about picking it up since I had read it before, and I thought, what can the new translation offer? But I was glad I read this. And speaking of Testament of Youth, I watched the new film adaptation that came out last year during the same week that I was reading those, because I was thinking about that. And it's a good adaptation. Not a great movie on its own, but if you've read it, there are some good scenes, especially on the beach. I don't want to spoil it if anybody's watching it who hasn't read the memoir, because they won't know what happens, but watching it, having read it, and knowing how things end up, there are some scenes with the 5 characters on a beach that are depressing, but pretty powerful. Although I don't think it's a great movie on its own. But anyway, it did make me want to reread Testament of Youth, so I may go and do that soon. So after that, I read The Best American Poetry 2013, which is a collection, and as with any collection, some of it's going to be good, some of it less good. I mostly picked this up because I felt like I hadn't read any modern poetry in a really long time, and I thought this would be an interesting way to pick up some authors, or to discover authors that I maybe hadn't heard of before. I made some notes of ones that I liked, but I think the problem with reading any collection like this is that there isn't enough context around them, and so I at least always feel like I'm missing out on a lot of what the author's intent might have been. I mean, some of these I think were published in magazines just on their own, so they weren't meant to be in any bigger context, but even so, I don't know that this is the best way to read poetry. It was entertaining enough, and there were enough interesting ones that I'm going to look at again later on their own, because I always think, you read someone whose style is not something that you appreciate, and then you move on to one that maybe you like better, and I always find that the mood changes, so, but maybe that's my fault for reading it almost straight through, as opposed to, well, I mean, I read it in a few sittings, but, maybe it's better to read one poem and walk away from it for a while. But that wasn't how I read it, so that's probably my own fault that I didn't enjoy it as much as I could have. Around the same time that I was reading these, I dropped my phone in water, and that destroyed it. So I ended up upgrading my phone and installing a bunch of apps. And what does this have to do with books? Well, I discovered all the free stuff that's available on Audible. So I don't normally listen to a huge number of audiobooks unless I'm on a road trip, or if I'm listening to a particular classic that I don't really want to read, but I feel like I should know more about, then I'll listen to that when I'm walking the dog. So I listened to a bunch of audiobooks just because they were there and they were free. So the first one that I listened to was John Scalzi's The Dispatcher, which is a short story. It's only about 2.5 hours long. The concept is that it's set in the near future, and for some reason, people who are murdered come back from the dead, although people who commit suicide or die from injuries or of old age or whatnot do not. And it was an interesting concept. As a short story, you don't get a huge investment in the world, and I don't know if he's going to be writing novels set in the same universe, because that would probably be more interesting than this was. This was almost like a single episode of a TV series, which is fine on its own, but maybe you want to see more. It was read by Zachary Quinto, who did a good enough job. Again, it's free. So I then also downloaded a couple of similar short stories from Michael J. Sullivan, who wrote the Riaria series. First was Professional Integrity, which was more obviously comedy, and then the second was The Jester. Both of these were about an hour long. They were amusing. I have the second book in that series, but I haven't read the first one, so I hadn't gotten to the second one. And having listened to these, I feel like I can just read the second one without reading the first, because I've got the introduction to the world. It's a fairly standard fantasy world. They were not super innovative, but I think both of these were written for collections rather than as part of the core series. And I think whenever an author is writing a series tie-in that is being sold for people who are not necessarily fans or even just readers of the series, they have to sort of walk that line, and I think these two stories both do that. So as I was downloading those off the Audible site, I realized that there are also a number of free streaming books if you have an Amazon Prime membership, so I listened to a couple of those as well. First one was, let's get the angle there, Everything I Never Told You by Celeste, which is read by Cassandra Campbell. I was looking forward to that book because I've heard a lot of reviews of that. A lot of people love it. The back blurb makes it sound almost like a mystery, because this girl from this family is dead. What happened? And a lot of the descriptions that I read of it made it sound more like a family character study. What I felt like it was almost a cautionary tale about if you don't talk to people, you're going to have an unhappy marriage, unhappy children, and possibly dead people. That was my takeaway. It was almost like, there's some of those children's stories where there's a moral of the story. This felt like there was a clear moral of the story. Like, talk to people. Which surprised me because I've heard so many glowing reviews, and I was compelled to keep going with it. I wanted to know what happened, and I wanted to know more about the people and their motivations, and, was hoping things would become clear. And they're just extremely unsympathetic people in circumstances that you would think would make them more sympathetic, because you look at the parents of this mystery death girl. So the parents of the girl who was found dead, and the mother, she was in university in the 1950s, and she wanted to go into medicine, but she wasn't able to do that because of, primarily life choices. The lead-up makes you think it's going to be because of institutionalized sexism, but ultimately it's a life choice that ruined her chances. And so you would think, okay, she faced all this sexism, that would make her more sympathetic, but it doesn't. And the husband, who's the father of the girl, he is a graduate student in the late 50s. He's Chinese American from a family that moved from California to someplace in the Midwest, and he grew up as just an extreme minority and is facing constant microaggressions and just sort of general hostility, and is not getting his top placement when he's graduating, and becoming a professor, and he's at a second-rate university or something. And so you should feel sympathetic, and yet he is utterly unsympathetic. It was almost surreal to me that there are these characters who are going through things that you should really feel for, and that are ultimately relatable in a lot of ways, and they're just horrible parents and horrible people and horrible to each other and horrible to their parents. I'm not normally someone who feels like I have to like the characters to like the book, and I really enjoyed a lot of the writing. The narrator made a strange choice in that she whispered a lot of the lines, which I think maybe gave it a kind of extra gravitas. So it felt that much more dramatic. But in a way, I think that helped because it made me pay more attention to it. Whereas I think if somebody had been reading it in a more standard way, or if I'd been reading it myself, I might have put different emphasis on parts. But I don't know. I have rarely read a book where the people were so sympathetic in situations where you should have sympathy. That said, I enjoyed it. So after listening to that, I listened to one more book, which was Columbine by Dave Cullen, narrated by Don Leslie. It's not a book that I would have listened to or picked up physically if it hadn't been this free option. I remember when it happened, when the shooting happened. I was in university at the time, and I remember seeing it in the news, but it wasn't as huge of an event for me as I think a lot of people who either were in high school themselves at the time or who had children who were in high school at the time. It was, I think, felt closer to them. It was interesting to hear about all of the things that were reported in the media at the time were exaggerations or misattributions or just completely fictitious. I remember reading a review of this that said everything you know about Columbine is wrong, and it's not quite everything, but it was a lot of things, so that was interesting to read. This was one book where I think you really feel the difference between having it narrated versus reading it yourself, and that was that it's written in a very casual conversational style, and there are a lot of quotes that are into the text, and because I was listening to it rather than reading it, you couldn't tell where the quotes began, and because of that I think it sounded even more casual, and that I wasn't super thrilled by. I also felt that like there were a lot of points where there must have been footnotes, and I would like to have been able to go and read the footnotes, and the footnotes are not recorded, and I mean even if they did, how would you associate them with each other? So I really felt the lack of that in this. That said, it is the kind of book that, despite being nonfiction, feels like a story, and it's written like a story. So for an audiobook, I felt like it worked with that, because for me at least, when I'm listening to it, I want to have that experience of someone is telling me a story. So this was successful that way. If I were more inclined to learn more about this, I would have to go and pick up the actual book to read the footnotes. But as someone who's just curious to find out more, this did a good enough job. I read Thomas King's Medicine River. This is a novel that is about a group of characters. The central character is a photographer and a group of his friends who live partially in Calgary and partially in Medicine River, which is a reserve in southern Alberta, presumably fairly close to the Montana border, which, by the way, they close at night, because when I lived in Calgary and I was used to the borders between Ontario and New York, my sister and my husband and I drove down to Montana for a day trip, and we couldn't get back at night because they closed the border at 11 o'clock. Borders in the east seem to be 24 hours. Anyway, that's not about the book, but just a warning if you're out there. That border closes. My dog was not happy the next day when we got back to her. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. This was good. This was originally published in the late 80s, and so it's about these characters in the 80s, and then the main character is reminiscing about his childhood, which was presumably in the 60s, I think, based on how old he was, maybe the 50s, because I feel like maybe he's in his 30s in this. In any case, it covers a period of time, which is really interesting, because if you think about Calgary now, which is a city of over 1 million people, it was really much smaller in those days, because, I mean, the population has really, really boomed during the oil boom. I mean, it's dropped a little bit now, but it's still... So it's interesting to have that context. It goes through a lot of the the interactions that are very much about small towns, but it also has a lot of content that is very much about southern Alberta in particular, or about Aboriginal experiences in Alberta in particular, which was interesting. And it's fun. I think there are a lot of, which I feel like I have to say because I feel like there are a lot of books that are set in the prairies in Alberta that end on a very depressing note. So I wanted to say this is not like that. This is, I mean, there is definitely an undercurrent of, you know, people are lucky, people are unlucky, but there's a certain upbeat hopefulness to this one that surprised me. Yeah, it's good. Finally, a book that I haven't finished yet. I'm reading In the Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrick, which is about the whaleship Essex that went down, and they made a movie about this recently, which I haven't watched yet, but I will. The point that I've gotten, the ship has just been hit by a whale, so everything before that is really about how the whaling industry was built up in Nantucket. Whales were being hunted to extinction in various areas, and they had to go bigger distances to find the whales, and which has been really interesting so far. I was surprised that the background was so as compelling. I was expecting to kind of want to flip through that to get to the lost at sea part, but no, it was really interesting to read about how their whole society was built around whaling, and what that meant with it. You know, men would be gone for 2 or 3 years at a time, and what that meant for the society. So yeah, interesting stuff so far, and looking forward to getting to the rest of it. So that was it for my mid-month to mid-month. Hope your mid-month is going well too. And just saw a bunch of discussion videos that I need to go watch, so I'm gonna go check those out. That's it. Ciao.